Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Matrosov, and first of all, I want to thank you, Jakob of OMH community and Adam Zabrodsky for inviting me today for this talk. And today I want to discuss with you guys about blind spots of platform security and hardware and firmware challenges. I think we've been focusing a lot of time on operating system level and higher level stacks, but hardware and firmware became kind of like a blind spot for our modern attack threat modeling and attack surfaces, so which has been overlooked for the years. And now it's actually the right time to take care about these attack surfaces, and we will be discuss today exactly why. So, but I want to introduce quickly myself. I'm Alex Matrosov. I'm doing security research over 20 years, and I've been starting from reverse engineering and researching a lot of bootkits, rootkits, and malware. Then I switched my focus to the hardware, and actually, like my past 5 years, I was building offensive security research at NVIDIA, and now I started my own company focused on firmware security, supply chain, and hardware. So basically, I try to protect exactly what I was discussing last probably 10 years over the conferences. Thank you, and I will start from also introducing my book. I was super happy last year. It got translated on Poland. It is a rootkit, bootkits, reverse engineering advanced threats. It's basically focused on different type of threats attacking on operating system level. And actually, mostly it's starting from the kernel mode rootkits, then move to the bootkits, and actually move down to the stack to the firmware. And I will keep intrigued because it's very interesting to get your opinion about the last part. I don't think much books discussing exactly this level of the threats. And I always make a joke about the cover of my book, because like when we've been thinking about the cover art, so we was basically getting this idea with the Kraken and some small guy with a bot which is trying to escape from the Kraken, but there is no way how he can do it. So basically, this bot and the guy, it's a usual malware analyst, which is sometimes just not get very deep on analyzing the threat, and they not understand what is actually under deep water of the code covering there. And actually on the top of the threat landscape, it's not very feasible what is actually waiting there on the deep waters of advanced threats. Okay, and let's discuss some attack surfaces. And actually, I would say because firmware being very frequently overlooked and not considered as a real threat or out of scope of the threat modeling, so security industry visibility point, it's been really like an iceberg. So we see what is on top of the water, but we don't see what is actually under the water. And modern persistent techniques, it's exactly actually keep very low, deep part of the iceberg, because it's not feasible for modern endpoint solutions, and it's actually not much tools exist to detect such of the threats. Also, if you think about like it's been a lot of techniques based on the persistence on operating system level, right? So modern EDR and endpoints focus it mostly on like memory, user space, operating system kernel, file systems, bootloaders and boot sectors, but they not go very deep to the firmware level. But actually it's changed a bit, but what they are doing, it's mostly they try to check the integrity. But in my opinion, integrity isn't enough to understand what is happening there, because when you have a broken integrity, you have a signal, something happens, but you don't know how you need to research this signal and do the next steps to understand what is an impact. So if you look on Mitra attack right now about the firmware corruption. So basically the modeling is pretty simple, and it's more about like integrity on the boot process, and they talking about breaking update authentication and elevating the privileges to the firmware. So basically integrity not equal to visibility, because you don't understand what is happening there. Also, OS privileges, it's very different from the firmware privileges level. And basically, it's not covering, as example, system management mode or management engine on x86 platforms. We really need to rethink how we basically score and understand the impact on such of the threats is attacking the modern firmwares. Also, updated firmware, it doesn't mean secure, because we have too much supply chain things happening right now. As example, vendors like Acer and some other Taiwanese vendors get attacked by ransomware, right? So, and if you have a ransomware in your network infrastructure, that's mean your infrastructure actually been hacked. It's not like you just get on one machine the ransomware and that's it, right? So if you get ransomware on your server, that's really mean somebody already been active in your network. And also SolarWinds, it's been basically very interesting case where we understand how supply chain can be complicated and well covered and hard to detect. So broken integrity doesn't say much about an actual impact, and it's exactly my message to the audience. We need to rethink our threat modeling and how we scoring the impact on the threats which is coming from the firmware and hardware. And currently, we don't have enough signals coming from firmware and hardware attack surfaces like we collect from the operating system, right? So on operating system level, we have a lot of sensors from modern endpoints, which is collecting a lot of data. And even if you don't have enough information from one channel of collection, you can maybe complement some information and the stats, such as the malicious operation is going on your machine, because you have enough data for that. But it's very different what's happening for the firmware and hardware. We doesn't have enough data which is coming from this way to analyze such of the incidents. Last year, I've been presenting on Off-Zone, Eco-Party, Platform Security Summit, and DevCamp, and I was discussing the advanced threat evolution and researchers' arm race when I was exactly discuss what kind of missing signals we have and what kind of development we need to do to enhance our endpoints and basically make this attack surface feasible. Also, on the machine, we live in three different worlds. We have firmware, hardware, and operating system. So, which is actually have a very weak security policies and transition between them. Basically, what's happening, we have like operating system, which doesn't connect much with the firmware, and firmware actually doesn't know much about the hardware, just transitioning the boot flow from the hardware to the firmware and then passing to the operating system level. Also, I like this note from Matthew Green from the last year when he been complaining what happening on the modern hardware world. It's exactly the problem which already been happening in the cryptography. So we basically not understand enough about the hardware because it's no information and it's not very transparent to the research. So basically, it's a lot of things which is working as a security by obscurity, and industry been learned its lessons from the past. Security by obscurity doesn't work because basically, anyway, it will be researched at one time and this model for covering the things will be broken. Also, if we think about platform boot process, actually the visibility and signals is decreasing from the operating system level to the hardware, because, as I mentioned it before, we live in three separate models or worlds. So we have a hardware threat model, we have a firmware threat model, we have operating system threat model, and in the from the perspective of the vendor who developed, in as example, hardware, they're not very well connected with operating system threat modeling teams, because it can be very different operating system. It can be Linux, it can be Windows-based operating system, and they just developing their part of the work, right? So their main thing, platform need to be booted, and operating system need to receive the control and continue the boot process. So it's what's happening, and unfortunately, same thing on the firmware. Sometimes like hardware vendors outsource the firmware, and firmware can be developed by the third party, and actually this third party don't know much about they know enough information to develop the firmware, but it can be not all the information about the hardware is open to the firmware developers from the third party company. So basically, we have a lot of things which is get very difficult on developing the hardware, and before actually it gets to the operating system level. And it's actually created really a lack of threat detection information and a lack of the signals to make these layers feasible from the threat intelligence perspective. Also, nowadays, it's hard to spot real boundaries between hardware and firmware and operating system level, because basically, when you open, as example, your lid of laptop, it's just blinking the screen almost immediately. But if you think about it, is very long boot process happens from hibernate to resurrect your machine and blink the screen. But it's not very feasible for the user, but it's a lot of processes happens on the hardware and firmware level. Also, a number of reported issues related to firmware significantly increasing every year. So basically, if we compare to the previous years, it's almost double every year, because first of all, it's more issues get reported and actually get officially recorded in the CVE database, but also actually more people start researching this space, which is very, very positive from my opinion, because we have more researchers looking. That means more problems can be discovered, and I think vendors will be think much more serious on such of the threats. Also, I like the slides from UEFI.org presentation from one of the webinars, and what actually saying here, it's about like threats identifications, right? So basically, threats can be identified and by analyzing the security requirements and platform diagram. Unfortunately, it's how can some of the product security teams think about detecting the threats, but threats not detected on the diagrams and also not detected by analyzing security requirements. Usually threats detected in the wild when the big platform get delivered to the client, right? Also, on the another slide, it's been proposed security through obscurity. So basically, it is firmware boundaries are freely available online, and tools to analyze these binaries are available. Security researchers can decompile, load to IDA and decompile the binaries. They can freely analyze. So if we limit the researchers to analyzing these binaries, it can help to protect the platforms. Actually not. Actually, real security and continuous cycle with offensive security research, such as the fuzzing and a lot of other things, helping to protect the platforms and the customers. But obscurity, it's only making things worse, because you can make it obscure, but it doesn't mean researcher can't get these firmwares to analyze, or like threat actors can't get these firmwares to analyze. So basically it's even more, I would say it's need to be more transparent platform security specifications available online to make the hardware more transparent from the analyst point of view, right? So I like what is happening on the RISC-V Foundation, and we have free ISA, we have a lot of other things which is very transparent and open specification, which is actually helps not only to security research community, it also helps to developers, right? So for the developers of the hardware, and basically drive this hardware much faster to the market. Also, if we think about hardware and firmware security boundaries, so basically it's separated from each other, because if you look on the modern hardware platform, it's a lot of components available there, and these components not very well connected in terms of firmwares and hardwares. It's actually executing separate things, which is used by, can be used by operating system level, or such as some of the firmware related drivers on system firmware, or like totally be separated and working on standalone computer. So, this slide, it is about like hardware and firmware security boundaries. It's not summary of all the boundaries on your machine. It's actually separated from each other, but it's need to be somehow connected. Otherwise, if you're not analyzing from security perspective the full picture, you can missing some attack surfaces and threat landscapes. And the system state transition between firmware layers and security boundaries is really defined by hardware, but frequently verified by firmware. What is happening there, if you define the security boundaries inside the hardware, and when it's transitioned to the firmware and this verification happens, you don't basically understand it. You don't have a feedback loop. When the transition happens, the firmware controls the boot flow, and you don't know if the verification on earlier stages is being correct, right? So it's same thing with a hardware root of trust. If you make a transition of the trust on the next layer, most likely the next layer will be responsible of controlling this trust. So, and it can be frequently failed, as I presented in 2016 with my research of breaking Intel bootguard on Black Hat. Also, like you can look on modern secure boot attacks from 2019 from Black Hat Asia and Opcode, when I've been discussing how we can bypass hardware root of trust. And also, it was very interesting finding when some of the platforms define the policies when you can remotely from enterprise policies on the laptop disable such of the technologies like a boot guard. What that means, basically, if the attacker will be able to access these policies and disable it, the platform will be will have a disabled secure boot, and it's actually very very dangerous from a physical attacks perspective. Also, if you look here, here it is a process of booting the platform with bootguard enabled. But problem here, it's exactly manufacturing mode. Basically, one of the attacks I presented on in 2019, it's been on Lenovo laptop with manufacturing mode. And this laptop, it just has a very weak platform configuration data, PCD, where you can find this blob on the firmware and just modify 1 byte to put the value to the true. And basically, this platform will be bypassed to skip verification for the Dixie firmware volume, which means all the SMM system management mode drivers, one of the most privileged mode on x86 platforms, will be just bypassed for verification. And the attacker actually can able to modify any drivers, and when it will be physically flashed with this modified byte, it will be full bypass. So complexity of modern firmwares and supply chains for the delivering the firmware, it's just increasing, and it's actually not controlled 100% by a single vendor. If you think about, we have a lot of different frameworks involved on the firmware development process, and all these firmwares all these components and actually developed by different vendors, like Intel or AMD providing reference code, right? So, and such as vendors like Phoenix, Inside, and American Megatrends developing the frameworks, which has actually been used with the companies like Dell, Lenovo, or HP to develop their own firmwares. And actually, in terms of the code exists from the vendor side, I mean, like Dell or Lenovo, it's less than 10% in the wild, and most of the code developed by the third parties. And it's actually create very complicated supply chain model for all these firmwares. Think about, if you have vulnerability in Intel reference code, you basically need to patch Intel reference code, deliver this update to American Megatrends or Phoenix, and then it will be get to Dell or other vendors. So it's very complicated, and usually patch cycle, even for the known vulnerabilities, it takes months, sometimes years. What about good old days with OS bootloaders? Yeah, sometimes actually it's remind me the things which has been happening on legacy BIOS with boot manager and winload and actual MBR, VBR, and other stuff, when it's been a golden time for, like, golden age for the bootkits, right? But if you think about on the operating system level, it's still some loaders exist. It's like a UEFI bootloader, boot manager, firmware EFI, and winload EFI. It's just been converted to support UEFI firmwares. And secure boot will save us, right? So, but unfortunately, what's happening, we can see on this particular screenshot, it's actually came from research did by ESET. So basically, they discover some of the modification of actual bootloaders. And scary thing, some people intentionally disabling the secure boot on their machines because they want some functionality or tweaks on their own firmwares. And usually it's actually open some attack surfaces for the attackers. I don't know how it will be basically increase the performance, but it definitely will be affect the security of the platform. Also, I've been presenting UEFI firmware rootkits, myths, and realities with a demo of UEFI ransomware, like proof of concept, of course, to demonstrate how such of the attack surfaces can be very easily exploited from the operating system level through the firmware and block the machine, and this, how the dangerous can be, how these attack surfaces can be dangerous. The next thing, it's actually verification of some of the known signed binaries from UEFI world. And one of them, it's actually been a Kaspersky bootloader if.efi, which has actually been signed and contains some of the vulnerabilities. So basically, the attacker can abuse these drivers with the known vulnerabilities, or as example, if this driver can be booted separately and the signature is not revoked, it can be abused by the attacker for the long time period. That means like signed doesn't equal trusted, because if we think about, we trust a lot to the signed binaries, and we don't understand if this vendor who provided such of the binary not been hacked or supply chain not been compromised for this vendor. So basically, we don't have enough visibility for such of the levels inside the firmware and hardware. Basically, we have a lot of tools available for the operating system level, and even there we can fail in detection and analysis. Also, this problem actually reminds me old vulnerability with MS16100 called Golden Key, which is actually being used for vulnerable boot manager bootmgr.efi to basically bypass some of the Windows security features and of course secure boot. So it's very old vulnerability, not very old, but it's almost 6 years old vulnerability been presented in 2016 on DEF CON, and it was very cool research. So, and we blindly trust anything which is signed and come from the trusted source. And as I already mentioned, because when it's signed, it's blind our security endpoints and a lot of other things. Some antiviruses actually trusted blindly to signed binaries if it comes, as example, from Microsoft and from some other vendors. But any vendor can be compromised, and we need to think about, we need to really rethink about how we trust signed binaries and what kind of visibility we need to develop to provide actual signals for enough signals to understand if even signed firmware not malicious. Think about it is actually known vulnerabilities like it's been discussed recently with a boot hole, and actually this vulnerability is tied to the grab bootloader, right? So basically, actually Dmitro Alexiuk been talking about some vulnerability in HP ProLiant server where secure boot being bypassed by actually signed bootloader, and it's been exploiting a known vulnerability with memory corruption on the flow. So basically you exploit the grab and you can bypass secure boot, and also you can do the same with Hyper-V bootkit. So here's actual vulnerability, and it is actually signed chain of trust. Yep. If you look here, it is a classical buffer overflow. So the diversity of the open source ecosystem also bring inconsistency of the boot process, and especially on the late stages when we're talking about the bootloaders. Another good example actually about such of the things when it came from the trusted vendor, but it can be vulnerable. It is example of Intel CSME vulnerability from 2019, 0090, where CSME ROM actually initialized directory turns off on the paging and maps ROM. And actually, it's still too early to switch on IOMMU protection, basically protect and isolate some of the memory pages. And the attacker will be able to remap some of the executed pages to arbitrary physical address in the SPI flash memory space. And it basically means you can write something on the SPI flash and it can be addressed from CSME, which is super interesting. And by the way, this vulnerability been in static boot ROM, which is immutable boot ROM, which is being actually not patchable. And this vulnerability, it was super hard to fix for Intel. And I really believe some of this vulnerability is actually not get patched on all the systems, and many of the systems which is basically being acquired in 2019 or earlier can be still vulnerable to this this vulnerability 2019-0019. And basically, the boot time software supply chain, it's only increasing the complexity. I mean, all these bootloaders and all these multiple layers of passing the control during the boot process, it's very complex, and it's get only complicated with the time because it's more parties get involved during the boot of the platform. I like actually very like this picture from the Peter Woods, which is presented at the Platform Security Summit, I like it here how he represents complexity of the attack surface. And if you can see, the privileges is actually growing to the trusted computing base, basically to the firmware and hardware, but the complexity of the attack surface is just increasing. So, which is very interesting because we've been always more thinking on the operating system level protection, but don't provide much visibility to the firmware and hardware. And let's talk a bit about like hardware root of trust. And nowadays, it's a lot of discussions about armoring root of trust of secure boot to the FPGA or silicon, right? So, but how it can be secure and that way? I want to refer very interesting research about like attacking Cisco Trust Anchor. It's exactly the case when FPGA became a trusted authority for authenticating the firmware and actually providing the root of trust for secure boot process. And it's actually been attacked in 2019 successfully when physically you can cut some of the traces, and then FPGA will be just blind because you have multiple parties just connected each other, but these chips, it's not really integrated. And when you're missing the FPGA root of trust, platform will be continue boots, but you don't have actual root of trust anymore. Another good example, it's about the bootloader inside the FPGA. And you know what? You have a mutable bootloader even on FPGA chip. And it's very good research from 2019 also, when it's been explaining, I think Sergei Skorobogatov from Cambridge, it's been explaining about Intel Max 10 vulnerabilities and how he find a little bug in the bootloader. So we blindly trust anything which is baked in silicon because we don't have enough visibility. We just not understand what is actually executing there. And we trust if, as example, vendor will say it is hardware-baked secure boot. If it is hardware-baked secure boot, many parties think it's secure by design, but it is not. So also, it's not rare about counterfeit devices or hardware implants. It's not a rare thing, and sometimes it can be found in the wild, especially when we're talking about like facilities of data centers, right? So it's a lot of hardware get delivered there, and physical attacks on such of the hardware during supply chain and delivering process. It's unfortunately it's not rare. But we really need to pay attention more to the hidden attack surfaces in hardware and firmware, where it's very hard to detect. If it will be some malicious implant as additional device installed on the server, it's feasible. But of course, if it will be small chip on the motherboard, just very gently soldered there, it's not that feasible. We can detect just expecting by visually this device. I think that's pretty much it from my end. Thank you very much for attention.